Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're doing our weekly episode, although we had an extra one come in this week, finishing up the councils that we've talked about in the 7 ecumenical. Pat and I finished that earlier in the week, so that was a pre-Christmas special. This will be in line with our regular weekly podcast, so you'll be able to find this on YouTube as well as on our 8 platforms in the podcast world. Couple announcements before we get launched right into the discussion today about Napoleon and Pope Pius VII. Number one, we are in the groundbreaking work of doing different merchandise and things like that. We have set it up. My wife has been helping do some designs. I've got a meeting with my group of guys in the board of trustees to discuss some of the ongoing things that are being built. And so we're going to look at some ideas that we're going to launch very, very soon. Looking forward to that. Some of the merchandise has already begun. We've been kind of testing some things like this one here is the Facts podcast hat, just, different covers, things like that, coffee mugs, T-shirts, different things that are going into even hoodies. I've been looking at some of the designs today, so that'll be coming out very, very soon. Also, another feature we just launched on the YouTube side is that you can be a member and get information sooner, as well as personal contact. Some of you have been giving through the link, which is going to be in the description as well. That's great. Keep doing that if that's what you're doing, but you can also just give toward the ministry by joining the membership. That is now available. We just launched that last week, not even a week ago, less than that. So you can find that as well. But today, looking into some of the things that are coming out, some of you wanted this different merchandise, so we're looking at that. Some of you wanted to do discussions on the side or have availability through social media and Zoom calls. So we're setting all that up. We're trying to make everything possible where people can come in and ask questions. Maybe you don't want to put it in a public forum where people can see it. We're trying to be sensitive to those things. So if you're interested in that, hit the membership. There's 2 tiers. One's a cheaper tier with some different features that you can be a part of. You can read through those. They're in the description of the membership list. And then there's a higher tier, which gives you obviously more information. You can also join that for a monthly subscription. Make sure you look into that if this is your first time. Also, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button on videos and the content that's coming on for YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast, hit the follow, hit that notification so that way when you get new episodes that come out, you are notified immediately. Also, another big deal that has helped us a lot on your favorite platforms of podcasts is leaving a review. You can leave a 5-star. No, you don't have to put words. Just leave a 5-star. But a review would go a long, long way. That is actually what moves the podcast up on searches. All right. Today, we're going to be talking about the deathbed restoration of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most intense figures in the French world. We want to talk about kind of the background of what led to his deathbed restoration. Most people don't even realize Napoleon had a deathbed restoration. We need to back up in time here. There's a lot that goes into what led to kind of a fallout that started really as a friendship. Napoleon kind of backstabbed the Pope. No shock there. He used the Pope to manipulate power in France while also offering really nice things for the Catholic Church. And then in turn, he actually backstabs, turns into this rivalry between Pope Pius VII and Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon tries to play ignorant about some of the things that ends up transpiring. Obviously, Napoleon is then defeated. And then there's this weird, time lapse that goes on between him and the French government that has been restored and the Pope and Rome. And so he had 5 years to think about things in his exile. And that led to some interesting end-of-life experiences. So we want to dig into all of that. And I want to bring in some of the conversation through the history of what goes on in France. Now, we need to remember the French government started very hostile before Napoleon toward the church. You have these revolutions that de-Christianized France. Now, churches had been close. There was a time where the French government was very much intact with the Roman influence of papal rule. That changed very, very quickly. There was actually state-sponsored atheistic movements that actually came into play here. Very cultic. There was a part where they just wanted to go into more of a secularized idea. And so they actually started a persecution of Christian ideas, and they were actually taking away churches. They were expelling certain freedoms that the churches once had. And so what ends up happening is one of the positive things, I should say, that happens is Napoleon wants to restore Catholic practices and Christian practices in France. Sounds great. Reestablishing the Catholic Church, really the public role that it had in keeping it in a state identifiable, thumbs up, you've got it, keep going, church can do what it needs to do kind of situation. On the other hand, Napoleon saw that as a part of not just restoring Christianity and its practices, but he wanted to use it for his power and benefit. So in 1801, Pope Pius VII works with Napoleon to negotiate the Concordat of 1801. Now, Napoleon wanted to restore religious appearances, and he did, in that matter of fact, but it was very surface level because at the end of the day, the arrangement set it up for where really France, the government, is actually dictating the church, not the other way around. So again, at the beginning of this, it sounds really good. It sounds like, oh, wow, Christianity has suffered a weird spell here in France. Napoleon wants to restore the things that were destroyed. Next thing you know, there's this agreement in 1801, and it doesn't work in favor of the church as much as it felt at first. So it didn't make Catholicism the actual religion of France, although it highlighted it, but it opened the door for other things like Protestant groups to serve freely and to do whatever they want. Now, Pope Pius VII had reservations about this whole thing. He's like, all right, we're going to do this, but I've got some reservations. But he wanted to sign it because it was really the best deal that could bring peace and Catholicism back into the church. Now, what ends up happening is over time, by 1805, Pius VII had become increasingly frustrated with Napoleon. Violations of papal territory had taken place. There's all kinds of fallouts where it seemed to be like, oh, well, letter of the law. We didn't break any contract. We didn't do anything wrong here. You need to get over yourself, Pope. Right? That's one of the arguments that comes in from Napoleon's perspective. One of the things that I find intriguing is that Napoleon decided in his understanding of things that he was going to rule the church, that he was going to, yes, let the Catholic Church do its thing, let the Pope do his thing, but it had to be under his watchful eye and approval. So here's the situation that ends up happening in France. There's a tension between papal authority and French authority through Napoleon himself. As a result of this papal authority being diminished, what ends up happening is Napoleon starts taking over places, not giving proper protocol for Catholic doctrine and practice towards warfare and things that go on in warfare. So Pius VII becomes frustrated, very frustrated. Now, let's back that up a little bit too, because Napoleon invited Pius VII to his crowning ceremony. And in doing that, Pius really didn't want to go to that. Pius didn't want to be a part of this. So he was dragged over there to be a part of this whole regime, this really facade that showed some sort of peace between the church and France, which was kind of a fake peace. And as a result of that, it doesn't go the way that, you would expect it to go. And that is that there's a friendship handshaking or something at the end of the day. No, Napoleon takes the crown. Instead of letting the Pope place it on his head, he places the crown on his own head, which is not really in keeping with the protocol of that day. So this becomes massively frustrating for Pius. From the very beginning, the Concordat was not really in keeping with good faith. It was meant to benefit France with this semi-promise of religious freedom back in France for the church. Falls apart, doesn't work. Now, what we do have is we have some of the correspondence of Pius VII, who begins to share his concern when it looks like France is going to invade the Vatican. Pius VII then gives us a a picture of what was happening months and days before he is actually kidnapped and taken back to France. Yes, you heard me right. The Pope was removed from the Vatican, taken back to France as a hostage by Napoleon to get his way. This is something similar to what we saw happen back with Vigilius and others during the ecumenical councils that Pat and I had already disclosed earlier. This goes back to something we've seen not commonly and frequently, but rather once in a while, imperial leaders do siege the Pope for their own benefit. Now, I haven't seen anything like this in a while. Now, there are times where this has happened and people have been taken away, either so-called to protect them or because a emperor wanted to get his way. Now, what ends up happening is the French invade the land. They invade the Vatican. Of course, Napoleon's going to play ignorant and dumb to this. Oh, I mean, I didn't tell anybody to arrest the Pope or anything like that. Sure. Yes, Napoleon was definitely behind the movement that ends up taking the actual Pope out of the Vatican, arresting him and putting him under so-called house arrest in France. Now, on June 10th, Pius VII in 1809 writes about what is about to take place. He knows hostility is moving in the Vatican. He fears he's about to be captured. Now, at this point, the French had already arrested bishops and cardinals and removed them from the Vatican. So Pius decides he's going to actually go along and excommunicate the French Catholics, including Napoleon. Now, this is going to be very important to the deathbed discussion and experience that happens later. So on June 10th, 1809, Pope Pius VII writes a bull, he writes an encyclical, and he excommunicates these French Catholics. Now, notice some of the comments that are made. I'm going to read them to you, to those that are listening on either of the platforms. Pius says, while in truth we are compelled to unsheath the sword of ecclesiastical severity, we do not in the least forget that we, however unworthy, represent on earth him, Christ, who even when he exercises justice, does not fail to be merciful. Now, remember, let me repaint this again. There are ecclesiastical figures, bishops, cardinals, who have been taken out of the city by French soldiers. Pius is compelled to excommunicate not only the people, but the acts. He feels like, and I love the pastoral language of Pius VII. He says, even though we're compelled to unsheath the sword of ecclesiastical severity, he says, we do not do this without recognizing the necessity of showing mercy in the midst of executing justice, because we represent the one who would have done the very same thing. Now, what I want to do is I want to ask the audience to kind of give their 10 cents here. When Napoleon, although he denied the effort to do this, sieged this city, did he do this act? Did the Pope show proper excommunication? Now, I'm going to say this. I believe that this is one of the most power under control acts I've ever seen of a Pope. When you're reading this, it's very, very important for us to engage the discussion about Pius's acts of what he believes to be the vicar of Christ, that he is the representative on earth, that while he is executing these acts on earth, he must be consistent with how Christ himself, though acting severely toward these opponents, would also act in mercy. So what Pius does is he opens the door for reconciliation. He says, I'm going to act in judgment, but I'm going to leave the door open for mercy. Now I'm going to read a little bit more as to what he says here. Now, what's interesting to me is that when you look at excommunications, what should they instill? What kind of things should be involved when you excommunicate? Should they be out of desire and excitement and, bolstering your opinion? No, actually, it should be sober. It should be completely sober to act in judgment of excommunication, because the sole purpose of excommunication is so that the punished would experience what it means to be punished and feel the weight of being detached from grace, from unity, from full acts of communion, so that you desire to see what your sin has done and bring you back to repentance. Now, the fruit of this, of what Pius VII does in this letter, is not felt for quite a few years. But I love the language of Pius and what he sees as important, that even though we unsheath the sword of ecclesiastical severity, we don't forget that we are representing Christ on earth, and that when we exercise justice, we will show mercy. For example, just weeks before Napoleon's troops enter into the very housing of the Pope and carried him off into captivity, the Holy City was invaded prior to this in February 2nd, 1808. Now remember, the letter is in June 10th, 1809, but don't forget, just prior to this, a year prior to this, they'd already invaded. So it's not like there wasn't acts and times of mercy and patience, that the French would actually do the right thing here. It's not like it happened overnight. The Papal States were formally annexed in the month of May 17th, 1809. So exactly, you got May and then June. May, they have moved closer and closer and closer. Now they're ready to actually take the Pope himself. So in the same letter, Pius VII excommunicated the people responsible, yet spoke with mercy toward them. He goes on to say, "We order and command that no one dare inflict injury, harm, injustice, or damage on those against whom this present letter is directed." What is Pius VII saying? He's putting this out for those in the Vatican, people that are housed, other clergy, saying, do not go after these people in a state that leads to violence by attacking them back. He said, for we, in using against our enemies that kind of punishment which God has willed to place in our hands, have above in view that those who now cause us such great suffering may be converted, if perhaps God would grant them repentance to know the truth. Remember what I said prior. The point of excommunication is so that there would be reconciliation and repentance on those who are excommunicated, that they would see the errors of their way, the sin, the infringement of friendship and communion would bring about some sort of brokenness that would lead to reconciliation through repentance. So he is telling the people of the Vatican, don't go out of your way. Don't go out and spend your time working to get even, killing people, starting conflicts. I am not sending this letter to start a war. I'm sending this letter to cause these invaders to think deeply about their actions, and so that they would become repentive. That's his point. He goes on, and as the armies, closed around the actual quarters where the Pope is, it is stated where he states that he lifts his hands in prayer and says, quote, "We commend again to God the most just cause more than our own, and declare ourselves ready to drink to the dregs the chalice which has been deigned to drink for his church." So he lifts his hands in prayer and says, we're ready to take this cup. If it means we go into captivity, if it means we are imprisoned, if it means we are killed, we will drink the cup that has been given to us. And then, in one of the most moving lines I've ever read from a pope who is in the midst of persecution, states this: "For us, there will be no day more joyful than that on which those very children who have caused us so many tribulations and sorrows should take refuge in our bosom and hasten to return to the sheepfold of the Lord." He is praying that he would do this act of excommunication with the heartbeat that these would come back to the sheepfold and experience the trueness of grace. Now, he's acknowledging that they have fallen from that act by their decisions and by their actions, but he wants to see Napoleon and his troops come back to the church in the sheepfold. Now, exactly 26 days after writing those words, Napoleon's forces broke into the actual quarters of the Pope, seized the Pope on the night of July 5th into July 6th, 1809. Now, the general who comes to arrest the Pope, it's incredible what was said of him. He states this idea that when he had entered in the chambers and saw the Pope there, that he remembered his first Eucharist. That he had almost had like a flashback. He sees the Pope and starts reminiscing and remembering his first ever communion. Can you imagine being that soldier, that general? You bust open the doors. You expect to, I guess, be fought against. Up to this point, nobody's fighting at the wishes of the Pope. You enter into the chambers. There is the Pope. You see him, an elderly man who is sitting there not willing to fight, but willing to be arrested, willing to go on with this charade that the French government has imposed on the Vatican, knowing the edict, knowing you've been excommunicated, and then you open the chambers, and in your mind, you have this ready to take the Pope on. I'm ready to do this for my country. I'm ready to do this for Napoleon kind of idea. And there is this fragile old man who represents Peter on earth. And you're willing to haul him away to France as a prisoner. And these flashbacks hit you of your first communion. And then there's a part of this person where you're like, what have I done? Let's fast forward. He goes on. He spends almost 5 years in France before he is let back. He then responds and writes another letter. But in this time, Napoleon is defeated. Napoleon is exiled to the island of St. Helena or Helena. As he is there, he becomes marooned. He's got almost 5 years to think through what just happened. I find it ironic the amount of years that Pope Pius VII had to spend in France was almost the same amount of years that Napoleon was exiled to the island. Could be a coincidence. Could be some sort of penance as well. I'm a little intrigued with the amount of time that goes by. Once I thought through this, you start seeing a correspondence. Now, remember, you're exiled. You've got time to think. Napoleon has time to think. A little bit of regret. Now, remember, he's still excommunicated. He's not only exiled, but he's excommunicated. I mean, he's got a double whammy here. He writes this, and he thinks about the things that are going on around him. Quote, "It would be to my heart a joy like nothing else." The Pope wrote to Cardinal Consalvi in 1817, "If I could help in lessening Napoleon's sufferings, he can no longer be dangerous to anyone. I could only wish that he may not cause anybody remorse." So Pius didn't forget Napoleon. He remembered him. He actually wanted the cardinal to think about Napoleon, who is exiled and suffering. Now, at this point, Napoleon's family has already been protected by Pius VII. Pius VII already was helping Napoleon by helping his family. Now, remember, Napoleon straight up kidnapped the Pope. I know he tried to play innocent, but nobody's stupid. We know what happened. In this act of trying to play ignorant, he then loses after all the arrogance, the pride, the viciousness. Napoleon was awful. I mean, let's be real. He wasn't a good guy. But for some reason, Pius VII couldn't get Napoleon out of his thoughts. He is already taking care of his family. That's being pastorally enough. But now he's even worried about the actual villain who took him, the Pope, the victim, back to France for 5 years. He is sitting there on an island, rotting, no longer armed or dangerous, just rotting and waiting to die. And the Pope writes to Cardinal Consalvi saying, if I could help in lessening Napoleon's suffering, I want to. What an act of grace. What an act of forgiveness, reconciliation, without even a single I'm sorry. Pius asked the cardinal to go to ask Great Britain's Prince Regent George IV to ease Napoleon's suffering. Now, that's an incredible example for all of us of how to love your enemy. So what ended up happening is the Pope was allowed to intervene here because obviously at this point, Great Britain had been the one that conquered the issues of the Napoleon, invasions and things like that. So they're the ones that excommunicated the guy through, as far as governmentally. The church had already excommunicated him much, much earlier in this. So what ends up happening is Pope Pius VII sends a priest to Saint Helena to go and comfort and work with Napoleon. Pius had learned that Napoleon actually wanted to be restored to the church. Now, at this point, it wasn't a happy time. You're in a barren, windy, isolated place. It's damp. He's already experiencing health problems. Water had to be actually carried to his house. It's not like he was in a great situation. He complained about the conditions. Napoleon wrote a lot about this, even in his last days, in his kind of memoirs or in his really going into his journal, that the place was bitter and that it was hard and that the environment was hard on his health. So he wrote letters complaining to even the British authorities, saying that he thought this place was unfair, that he was being overly sabotaged and given bad circumstances. So he hated where he was. But the news had reached Pope Pius VII that Napoleon, wanted to be reconciled back to the church. So he sends this priest that he wanted to work through the sacraments to be rejoined to the church. In fact, one of these statements is made. Napoleon states, I die in the bosom of the apostolic and Roman church. In his will, Napoleon said he wanted to be buried according to the rites of the Roman Catholic Church. I want to go back to what happened prior, and I want you to remember this. I've read it a minute ago. I'm going to read it again. Pius VII, back in 1809, prior to his own exile in France and the exile of Napoleon and this island, he said, while in truth we are compelled to unsheath the sword of ecclesiastical severity, we do not at the least forget that, however unworthy, we represent him on earth, even when we exercise justice, and we must not fail to be merciful. And he stated again, We order and command that no one dare inflict injury or harm or injustice on the damages of those who have done this. For we, using against our enemies this kind of punishment which God has willed to place in our hands, have above all in view that those who now use us such great suffering may be converted, if perhaps God would grant them repentance to know the truth. What's happening? What is going on? What was written many, many years before by Pius VII has now come to full fruition. Why should the church today excommunicate disobedient or heretical figures? Not out of hate, not out of delight, not out of celebration, but out of the soul of those that are doing wrong, that it would bring them to a state of repentance. See, everybody's afraid today, including papal figures, to bring out some sort of excommunication. They're afraid to draw or remove the sword from the sheath, as Pius VII said, because they don't want to hurt feelings. They don't want to lose money. They don't want to lose all these other things. Look, excommunication is a good thing because it's intending to bring people back to reconciliation to the church. It took years and years for Napoleon to think through the ramifications of what is now going to come to its full end, where Napoleon sees, I have made a horrible mistake of my life. So that by the year of 1821, in February of 1821, Napoleon's health has declined massively. In March, he is bedridden. He could no longer take the cold weather. He had to set up his room to try to stay warm. Now, according to the stories here, Napoleon knew he was about to die and only wanted to experience the final act of being reconciled in his soul to God. So in April 29th, 1821, when the priest the Pope had sent entered into the room of Napoleon, Napoleon did a bedside confession and received the sacrament of absolution. Confession and absolution. Now, he couldn't take the Eucharist because at this point he couldn't hold food down, but his soul is stated to have been at peace once he was given the absolution. On Saturday that evening, May 5th, 1821, even though it was hot, Napoleon silently passed from life to death. Now, most people don't talk about this. Most people don't deal with what actually happened. Because we look at Napoleon and we look at his conquests, we look at his victories, we look at his defeat, we look at his exile, but most people don't realize that there's a redemptive story here. When Pius VII was a prisoner in Savannah, Napoleon had said these words: "The power that rules over souls has a greater sway than that which rules over bodies." Napoleon had not only showed that he knew internally, I can capture the Pope and his body and even bring him into subjection to my desires. But the Pope is the only one who can conquer the soul with Christ on earth. He knew who the vicar of Christ was. See, all this time, Napoleon had battled some sort of, I need all power. He wanted to be God, if you would. But there's one thing that Napoleon couldn't control: the souls of men. He didn't have the power to bind and loose on the earth. as it relates to the soul. He could bind and loose the body, but not the soul. And Napoleon finally comes to recognize this. He had not been able to conquer the Pope. But ironically enough, by the excommunication of Pius VII, he was able to bind Napoleon. Even while being bound physically by Napoleon, Pius VII, by excommunication, was able to bind the soul that forevermore, to the end of Napoleon's life, haunted him in exile. It haunted him all the way to his deathbed. And Pius VII sent his delegate priest to bring the sacrament of confession and absolution to a sick, dying man who committed some of the most gruesome sins any of us could imagine in warfare. Two and a half years after Napoleon's dead, after he had died, Pius achieved his own triumph. On July 6, 1823, Pope Pius VII, as an 80-year-old man, went into his chamber sick. After being taken to his bed, he was there for about a month. He did not recover from his sickness. I mean, he's an old man at this point. He had reached the end of his life. It is said that in his illness, he could not bear to hear the words, "Most Holy Father." It's odd, but he would say, "Don't call me that. Call me poor sinner." Pius VII remained a humble man when he's in an act of judgment, and even in the last moments of death. He saw himself as a servant of servants. That is what a pope should have been. We see that even prior to his lifetime, many popes were not of the disposition of Pius VII. One of the greats. All the Piuses were kind of bad A's, but specifically looking at it from this perspective, just how he handled his imprisonment, how he handled prior to his imprisonment, post-imprisonment, his enemies, he was one of a kind. On August 17th, Pius made his final communion, and 2 days later, he received last rites. On August 20th, 1823, while absorbed in prayer, in the middle and act of praying, he passed away. For 3 nights, Cardinal Consalvi had kept vigil near the Pope's bed. Seeing Pius VII had breathed his last, Consalvi knelt by the bedside. There he prayed and gave these wonderful words and tears as he began to depart into eternity. And boy, that must have been one heck of a celebration into the heavenlies. One of the things that I wanted to focus on kind of in closing this out is we need to look at excommunication very different. I'm afraid that modern ideas and thinkings of excommunications, whether you're talking about particularly in the Catholic world, you've got bishops in Germany who are playing foolish, acting foolish, making foolish choices. And there's this, well, we need to keep having discussions. I mean, that's been going on for years, all the way back with Benedict XVI into Francis and now Leo. Look, the time to talk is over. Yes, there's a time to negotiate. There's a time to talk, but there's certain points where really the church needs to unsheath the sword of justice and act in severity with mercy, as Pius VII did, to save these bishops' souls and those they are leading astray. Excommunication doesn't have to be vicious and death strikes to the body, but they should be alarms and death strikes to the soul, so that the soul is bound to wander and feel and experience the seriousness of sin and disobedience. with the door open always to experience reconciliation. I wonder how many of you in the audience think about excommunication in that light. I'd love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts. But Napoleon, based on history, was fully reconciled to the church and said, I die within the Holy Catholic Church, received last rites, and according to the teaching of the church, was restored. What a story. What a restoration. What a deathbed, intriguing story about Napoleon. I challenge anybody to go read and study Napoleon, read and study Pius VII. There's good works on that. There's books written on this. There's an article that I used today from the Catholic textbook. It's a very quick read. It's called Napoleon Reconciled with God, May 5th, 1821. Came from Light to the Nations and the Making of the Modern World. You can read some of this as it was given. Beautiful words and research has been done here. Not a lot, I will admit, not a lot. But the papal letters that I've read from, they are on the website from the Vatican. Now, they are in Italian, and you would need to have those translated. There's links, then they'll let you do that on Google or whatever, AI can translate if you need. There are ways to restore that into English to read. Read these letters. Read what Pius said before and after he was imprisoned. There's some incredible language that's going on in these things. So, my goodness, let's think differently about history. Let's think differently about the present and the future and excommunications and how a pope should look. One of the great examples is Pius VII. Well, folks, if this is your first time listening to Facts, we're so glad you joined us. As I stated at the very beginning, we are working on a merchandise store. I gave some examples of, hats and things like that. We're working on cups and t-shirts and all of these different items that have the Facts logo on it. That is going to be releasing very soon. As I stated at the beginning of the program, I am working with the board of trustees on releasing some of this and the timing of that. We did launch on YouTube, where you can become a member for 2 tiers, a cheaper tier and a little bit more expensive tier that gives you the opportunity to engage with us more personally and to get more content that we're going to start releasing as of January the 1st. So look into that. Look at the different tiers. You can click that on YouTube. Also, if you're not on YouTube, you still want to give, or you are on YouTube and you don't want to be a member yet, there are links that are in the description that'll allow you to give monthly or a one-time donation. That is a tax deductible item because we are a 501c3. Please look into that. That is available for you as well. We're looking forward to 2026. We have a lot of episodes lined up. One that is coming next week, I'm going to be doing a recording with Eastern Orthodox, an individual. I'm going to reveal his name later. He is finishing up his PhD in archaeology. And we are going to be doing an East and West discussion from Gavin Ortland, talking about the idea of innovation and accretions as it relates to infant baptism and his discussion and statements of iconography from Nicaea II. That is coming in the very, very near future. Please make sure you check that out. As always, folks, grace and peace to you. God bless.